Over the years, there have been plenty of different ways to listen to pre-recorded music in a vehicle. What you see on screen now is just a small selection of the formats that have been used for this purpose. I suppose nowadays the most common way would be to stream music over Bluetooth or, of course, as always, listen to the radio. But I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about what happened when the player in your vehicle wasn't capable of playing the current format of choice. Now, the 8-track had a pretty good run. It started off in the 1960s and you could still buy current releases on it all the way up to the mid-1980s. But really, its heyday was the 70s, particularly the earlier part of the 70s. Towards the end of the 70s, the compact cassette had pretty much took over and ate its lunch. So what happened if your vehicle contained an 8-track player and you wanted to play compact cassettes? Well, of course, you could get a new vehicle, you could get a new tape player, or you could get a cassette adapter. Now, there were a lot of manufacturers of these. In fact, I think there were too many because there's still a lot of new old stock on eBay, which is what this is. Now, I think these were supposed to be sold to people that didn't want to replace the deck in their vehicle. Perhaps they didn't have the money for it, maybe like a student who got an old vehicle, or perhaps even someone with a load of 8-track tapes who didn't have many compact cassettes. Now, we've got controls on here for stop, play and fast forward. Note there's no rewind. If we press the stop, that's the eject button as well. Now, these would have been a cheaper alternative to getting a cassette deck fitted in your vehicle, but this isn't bad as far as a mechanism goes. It looks pretty decent quality. It's effectively a 1970s cassette deck with a nice metal tray shoved onto the end of an 8-track cartridge. If we look around the other end, you can see the part that goes into the 8-track player, and that simulates tape going past the heads in the machine. Unsurprisingly, I don't have an 8-track player in my car. However, I do have one in the house. In fact, I've got a couple. This is the backup one, and this one works fine, so we can test it out in this. Okay, it doesn't sound great, but that's why it's the backup player. The quality one's in the hi-fi in the lounge. Now, notice how far this hangs out the front. That's quite a big distance to stick out in a vehicle, but let's have a listen. I'm happy to see that everything works, including the fast forward. The sound isn't pleasant to listen to. It's quite distorted. It comes out of the outputs too hot. However, the fact that this thing's been sat in its box for perhaps 40 years or so, it's good that it works at all. Now, the reason I bought this was to figure out how these things work. Obviously, the front goes in the 8-track player, the back is a cassette player that hangs out. How does a cassette get the power to move? I used to think maybe there was some sort of wheel that drove a belt inside, but that's not the case. Looking at this, there's nothing like that. There's just these two metal pins on one end. And apparently, according to the specs, it uses a power supply between 11 volts and 25 volts. Well, there's no battery inside this thing, so how's it getting that power? I think the only way I'm going to find out is by taking it apart. I'm doing this very carefully because I do plan on putting it back together again and using it later on in the video, but it came apart really easily. You can see the compact cassette deck at the top there, and then in the bottom on this circuit board attached to that with a spring is this item which pushes against the playheads in the 8-track deck and simulates tape going past by sending magnetic pulses. We've got these two metal arms here which are spring loaded. Those are attached to that circuit board which is attached to the motor in the top here, which has a belt in it, which luckily hasn't perished. And then we've got the controls on the end there, and then this wire goes from the cassette deck playhead all the way down into the circuit board at the bottom, and of course ultimately to that device which attaches to the playheads in the 8-track player. You can see the circuit board here. I've just got this out to show you what's underneath it. Not an awful lot, but there is a variable pot on there. I wonder if that would adjust those output levels. Anyway, I've got to put it all back together again because I still want to find out exactly what those two metal prongs are touching inside my 8-track player. So let's have a look inside the door. Now, if you look towards the centre of the image, you'll see a black piece of plastic with a red wire coming out of the bottom. It's got metallic contacts either side. Those two spring-loaded arms attach to those two contacts and draw power from it. Now, what is that thing? Well, it's a sensor. The original purpose of it is supposed to push against the tape inside an 8-track cartridge. When the tape has gone through a full cycle, it brings the piece of metallic tape around which completes the circuit between those two sensors, and that's what drops the head down to play the next program. So it's just a sensor, but surprisingly enough, there's plenty of voltage going through it, somewhere between 11 and 25 volts, which is ample to power a compact cassette player. And since those sensors are in the same place in every 8-track player, they can make a universal 8-track to compact cassette adapter. It's quite ingenious really when you think about it. Okay, so that's how some people manage to play compact cassettes on their old 8-track players, but let's move the same problem on perhaps 20 years or so later, and you've now got an older vehicle with a compact cassette player, but you want to play MP3s on it. Well, the most common way to do that would be to plug the headphone output of your music playing device into one of these adapters and put that into your cassette player. But that's a little bit boring and simple. I want to show you something a little bit more interesting that you might not have seen before. It's an MP3 player that's inside a cassette. And you can just put this into your cassette player and it'll play your MP3s without having any wires hanging down. Let's have a look at it. Now, this is a cheap device. Costs about £10 or so, and look at all the things you get with it. Now, that tells me that these power supplies are not worth keeping. They feel nasty as well. I always recommend that people do not use cheap Chinese power adapters that are supplied with dash cams or anything else. You can tell that they're nasty just by the fact that you can pull them apart with your hands. Just put them in the bin and go and use a proper power supply, proper USB charger that you've got from somewhere else. Now, I was trying to put a year on when this thing came to market. Obviously, it's not a new device. It's for when people had cassette players and they wanted to play MP3s. It says here it supports Windows 2000 and XP, which put it somewhere after 2001. And it also mentions that the maximum SD card size it will support is 8 gigabytes. Now, whether that was the maximum size you could get at the time, not too sure, but you kind of get the idea. Somewhere sort of early to mid 2000s, I'd think. Now, it's got the same kind of head mechanism as the other one. It's got a head covered in a piece of plastic so it doesn't scratch the head in your machine, and that pushes against it and sends the magnetic pulses through. Your memory card goes in the back there, full-size SD card, and we've got controls on here to operate it. And we've got an on-off switch on the side. On the other side, it's got an infrared receiver, USB charger, and a headphone port, because you can actually use this as a separate MP3 player and carry it around with you without having to use it in a vehicle. So turn it on, got some power there, got a little remote control with this as well with a button cell in it. And of course the idea with that remote control is you point it at the tape player, which is protruding from the edge of your machine, as on this picture here, so you can jump between tracks and things. But I'm going to be using this in a different machine. I haven't got a car tape player again. I've got a home tape player, quite a few of them, so I'm going to use it in that. We'll put this SD card in here, which I put some music on from the YouTube audio library, and I'm going to play it in this cassette player. Now, of course, when it's inside here, I won't have access to that infrared remote receiver, so we'll have to see how this works. It's also a bit of a tight fit. That on-off switch sticks out of the side of it a little bit, which makes the cassette a little bit wider than a normal cassette. So I'm to jam it in the tray here to get it inside the machine. Notice the red light's flashing there. That happened as soon as I turned it on. And it turns out that means that it's playing. As soon as you turn it on, it starts playing. So when I press play on my machine, the head goes against the tape and plays back what the MP3 player is currently playing. The instructions here indicate that the MP3s are played in a random order, and of course, as I mentioned, as soon as you switch it on, it will start playing those one after the other. It does sound pretty decent though. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the quality of the sound. Much better than the cassette to 8-track adapter I'd used earlier on. This just sounds like any old MP3 player. Now, I'm putting it in a different machine so I can test out the infrared remote control on it, because I'll have access to it from the side of this, because the infrared port is on the left hand side of the cassette here and I can point the remote at it. So let's just see if it works. So with that all working fine, I then wanted to know whether or not the transport controls on my cassette player would have any influence on the MP3s being played. Now, initially you seem to think that something's happening, because when you press stop, they stop. When you press play, they play again. but it's doing nothing at all. All that's happening is the MP3 player is still playing the music in the background. You can see the red light flashing all the time. All that's happening is you're moving your playhead away from it, which means that it's not hearing the sound that it's producing. Anyway, let's have a look inside this to see if there's anything clever or interesting in here at all, because if I don't take it apart, someone will definitely ask me to, so might as well do it now. So there you go, you can see you've got a circuit board in there, which is a simple little MP3 player and of course an SD card reader. Got a few cogs here which are just there to convince your tape machine that it's got a cassette in it. Some will stop, of course, and stop playing if they think they've got to the end of the side. All this is doing, it's connecting a load of cogs from one side to the other just to keep your cassette player happy in thinking that it's actually playing a tape that's still continuing. But that's all that those are there for. They don't do any button pressing or anything like that. There's no connection with the circuit board. And here's a little rechargeable battery which powers the MP3, no power drawn from the cassette deck itself. And oh, 200 milliamp hours. That's not right, is it? Because if we look at the specs on the box, 450 milliamp hour lithium-ion battery. Well, of course, it's not unexpected, really, is it? I mean, this is just a little cheap thing. It's probably a copy of an original. But it is version 1.0. I don't think they ever did any after this by the looks of it. So we've got an MP3 player in a cassette, we've got a cassette adapter for an 8-track player. You can guess what I want to do now. That's right, play an MP3 in an 8-track. And I'm not having much luck because the cassette won't go inside the adapter. And it's to do with that on-off switch on the side there. It's making it too wide to fit in there. Every time I put it in, it switches itself off again. Well, I'll be damned if I'm having my stupid dreams of doing something completely pointless dashed by a piece of plastic. There we go, get that off the side of there. We can still operate the on-off switch, albeit with a screwdriver or something. And now finally we can try and play an MP3 in an 8-track player. You can see it's flashing away there at the top, which means it's playing, so let's have a listen. Okay, so that was a complete waste of time, but it's made me happy anyway, and it works fine. So next thing I want to try, let's see if we can make this into a portable device. So we now want a portable 8-track MP3 player. Plug this into the side. Look how sleek and easy to carry that is. The trouble is, it doesn't work, and the reason is because this particular 8-track player doesn't have an auto change mechanism, which means there's no power supply to the 8-track cartridge or to the cassette player that follows, and therefore the circuitry isn't activated. If you want to carry around this MP3 player, you can do it in a traditional way like this. I suppose it makes a novelty MP3 player and it all works fine. It has a battery life apparently of 6 hours, but this bit about the 8GB maximum SD card support, that's going to be annoying to some people. So let's see if it'll take a bigger card. I've got a 16GB one here. I've put 10 gigs worth of MP3s on it, which is quite a lot of tracks still, and it works fine. So yeah, I don't know if that's a real limitation or just something that's printed on the documentation. But anyway, in this video we've gone from 8-track to compact cassette to MP3, and I hope you've enjoyed this little bit of messing around with history. If you want to get hold of an 8-track player or an adapter, there's loads of those on eBay. The speaker I've reviewed separately, there's a link in the video description, and the MP3 cassette adapter, well, I'll have links to that in the video description as well. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.